Ranking the nations of World War II by power sounds on the surface like a straightforward exercise. Count the tanks, count the divisions, count the ships, arrange them in descending order, and call it done. It is the kind of analysis that fills the first chapter of 100 different popular histories, and it almost always produces a picture that is technically accurate and operationally misleading in equal measure. Because power in a total war is not a fixed quantity. It is not a number you can read off a production ledger in January of 1942 and expect to still be accurate in January of 1944. Power in a total war is a system. The interaction of industrial capacity, geographic reality, manpower reserves, institutional quality, logistical reach, political cohesion, and the specific kind of strategic will that determines whether a nation, when it has absorbed more punishment than its planners ever modeled, keeps fighting or stops. Some nations that look powerful on paper dissolve under the first serious pressure. Some nations that look broken find capabilities that no pre-war assessment predicted. And some nations, one nation in particular, demonstrate a form of power so fundamentally different from every other participant that the standard framework for measuring military strength simply fails to capture what it is looking at. This is every major nation in World War II ranked by the power that actually mattered. Not the power they started with, the power they demonstrated when the war demanded everything they had. Tier 1. The industrial titans, the nations whose output made the outcome inevitable. The United States, the arsenal that changed what war was. Start here because not starting here distorts everything that follows. The United States entered World War II in December of 1941 as the largest economy on the planet, a fact that was well understood by every major power's strategic planning apparatus before Pearl Harbor. What was not fully understood by anyone, including the Americans themselves, was the speed and scale at which that economic capacity could be converted into military production when the political constraints on doing so were removed. The numbers, stated plainly, are almost incomprehensible. Between 1941 and 1945, American factories produced 86,000 tanks, where nearly 300,000 aircraft, over 600,000 jeeps, 2 million trucks, and more than 40 billion rounds of small arms ammunition. In 1943 alone, the United States produced more aircraft than Germany, Japan, Italy, and the Soviet Union combined. By 1944, American shipyards were completing a new Liberty cargo vessel, 10,000 tons of supply carrying capacity, approximately every 42 hours. This was not military power in the conventional sense. It was something for which the standard vocabulary of military analysis is genuinely inadequate. The Americans did not bring a bigger army to the contest. They brought a different category of contest. They converted the war from a competition between military forces into a competition between industrial systems. And then they operated the most productive industrial system in human history at full wartime capacity for 4 consecutive years. The strategic implications were absolute. Every nation whose military planning was built around the assumption that wars were decided by the quality and doctrine of fighting forces, Germany, Japan, to some extent Britain, was operating inside a framework that American industrial power made obsolete. You cannot outmaneuver a supply chain that delivers 12,500 tons of material to the front every single day. You cannot outfight an enemy whose tank losses are replaced faster than you can count them. You cannot outlast a furnace that does not acknowledge the concept of running out. American combat performance in the early stages of the war was uneven. Kasserine Pass demonstrated the gap between industrial potential and operational readiness clearly enough. But American institutional capacity to learn, adapt, and improve compressed that gap at a rate no other nation matched. The same force that was tactically outclassed in Tunisia in February of 1943 was landing with sophisticated combined arms doctrine in Sicily 5 months later. The United States is not ranked first in this analysis because it had the best soldiers or the most elegant doctrine. It is ranked first because it changed the definition of what winning a world war required. And then it was the only nation on the planet capable of meeting the new definition. The Soviet Union, the nation that absorbed the unabsorbable second. Not close second, genuinely operationally second, but the distance between first and second on this list is larger than the distance between any other 2 adjacent rankings. Because what the Soviet Union accomplished in World War II exists in a category that resists comfortable summary. Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, with the most operationally capable military force in the world, and proceeded to inflict losses on the Soviet armed forces that, by any historical precedent, should have ended the Soviet capacity to resist within months. In the first 6 months of Barbarossa, the Wehrmacht captured or destroyed over 3 million Soviet soldiers, thousands of tanks, and tens of thousands of artillery pieces. Entire Soviet army groups ceased to exist as functional military formations. The Soviet Union kept fighting. This is the fact that sits at the center of any serious analysis of World War II power, and it demands explanation rather than assumption. The Soviet capacity to absorb catastrophic losses and regenerate fighting power was not simply a function of geographic size or population numbers, though both mattered. It was a function of institutional decisions made before the war, the forced industrialization of the 1930s, the relocation of industrial capacity east of the Ural Mountains that began within weeks of the German invasion, the centralized mobilization system that could conscript, equip, and deploy replacement formations at a pace that German operational planning had not modeled. The T-34 production figures tell the story at its most concrete. In 1941, Soviet factories produced approximately 3,000 T-34s. In 1942, as German forces occupied significant portions of Soviet industrial territory, production increased to 12,500. By 1944, with Soviet industry operating at full wartime capacity in its relocated eastern facilities, annual T-34 production exceeded 14,000. Germany produced approximately 1,300 Tiger Is across the entire war. If the story of American power is the story of industrial capacity converted into military output, no, the story of Soviet power is the story of national will converted into strategic endurance. 27 million Soviet dead, military and civilian combined, is a number that resists emotional processing. It is simply too large. What it represents operationally is a nation that paid a price no other participant in the war came close to paying, and kept generating armies capable of offensive operations until those armies reached Berlin. Save this one. The framework for understanding how the Soviet Union absorbed and reversed the German invasion, the industrial relocation, the manpower mobilization, the progressive development of operational art that produced the deep battle doctrine of 1943 and beyond. This is a reference point for understanding how large nations survive existential threats that should, by conventional analysis, be unsurvivable. Tier 2. The major powers, nations with genuine strategic weight. Germany, the most capable military that lost, anyway third. And the placement requires explanation because Germany's military performance between 1939 and 1943 represents one of the highest expressions of operational art in modern military history, a force that consistently achieved results against numerically superior opponents through doctrine, training, and institutional quality that its enemies spent years trying to understand and replicate. The Wehrmacht of 1939 was not powerful because it had the best equipment. In many technical categories, it did not. It was powerful because it had developed and institutionalized a command philosophy, off-tracks tactic, mission-based tactics, that pushed decision-making authority to the lowest capable level, rewarded initiative, and generated operational tempo that opposing command cycles could not match. France in 1940 did not fall because German tanks were superior to French tanks. It fell because German operational doctrine was superior to French operational doctrine, and because the gap between those two things was larger than anyone on the Allied side had modeled. At its peak in the summer of 1941, Germany controlled more of Europe than any power since Napoleon, had demonstrated the fastest and most complete military conquest in modern history, and possessed a military establishment whose junior and mid-level leadership represented arguably the finest tactical corps in the world. By 1943, the structural weaknesses that had always existed beneath the operational brilliance were becoming impossible to offset. German industrial production, despite the heroic efforts of Albert Speer's reorganization program, was operating in a strategic environment for which it had never been designed. A two-front war of attrition against industrial opponents with combined output that German production could not match regardless of efficiency improvements. The manpower pool that fed the tactical excellence of the early Wehrmacht was being consumed by the Eastern Front at a rate that no recruitment or training program could sustain. Germany is ranked third because its military capability at its peak was genuine and formidable. And because the story of how that capability was systematically destroyed by strategic decisions that its own most capable officers recognize as fatal in real time is the most instructive military cautionary tale of the 20th century. Like this video if the mechanism underneath why Germany's operational excellence ultimately could not offset its strategic failures is the kind of analysis you came here for. Because this channel is going to keep pulling at that thread. Britain, the nation that stayed in the war when it should have left fourth. And the ranking requires a specific kind of honesty about what British power actually consisted of, because Britain's contribution to the Allied victory is both genuinely significant and consistently mischaracterized in the popular account. Britain in 1940 was, by any rational strategic calculation, a nation that had run out of options. France had fallen. The British Expeditionary Force had escaped from Dunkirk with its men but without its equipment. The Luftwaffe was conducting sustained bombing campaigns against British cities and industrial centers. America was not yet in the war. The Soviet Union was Germany's non-aggression partner. The strategic logic of negotiation, finding terms with Germany before the situation deteriorated further, was not, in 1940, the position of fools or cowards. It was the position of several serious and capable people who were looking at the same facts Churchill was looking at and reaching different conclusions. Churchill's decision to fight, to frame the conflict in terms that made negotiation politically impossible and national resistance psychologically necessary, was not a military decision. It was a political and rhetorical one. And it was, in retrospect, one of the most consequential decisions any national leader made in the entire war, because it kept Britain in the conflict long enough for the strategic situation to transform into something that made winning possible. British military performance across the war was uneven in ways that German commanders noted with professional frustration and Allied commanders noted with varying degrees of diplomatic restraint. The caution that German intelligence characterized as a defining feature of British tactical behavior, the preference for massive pre-planned artillery preparation, the reluctance to exploit success without explicit authorization from higher command, was a real operational characteristic with real operational costs. But British military contribution was never primarily about tactical performance at the division level. It was about strategic persistence, the maintenance of the Atlantic supply lines through 4 years of submarine warfare, the development and execution of the strategic bombing campaign, the intelligence infrastructure centered on Bletchley Park, whose operational value remains difficult to fully quantify but was genuinely significant, and the provision of a Western Front base from which the American military could be projected into the European theater. Britain stayed in the war when the strategic logic of staying was genuinely questionable. That decision, beyond more than any tactical performance, is what earns its place in this ranking. Tier 3, the significant contributors, Japan. The strategic overreach that made its own defeat. Japan's placement in this ranking is complicated by geography in a way that no other major powers is, because Japan's power existed in a strategic context, Pacific maritime warfare, that was so distinct from the European theater that direct comparison requires constant qualification. Within its specific operational context, Japan in 1941 and 1942 was a formidable military power. The Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier aviation capability, demonstrated at Pearl Harbor and in the early Pacific campaigns, was the most sophisticated naval air power in the world at that moment. Japanese infantry doctrine, built around aggressive offensive action and the exploitation of surprise, produced operational results in Malaya, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies that stunned British and American commanders who had significantly underestimated the capability they were facing. The strategic problem was the same one that destroyed Germany, expressed in Pacific terms. Japan's military power was genuine and locally formidable. Japan's industrial base was not capable of sustaining a prolonged war of attrition against the United States. The decision to attack Pearl Harbor, intended to buy time for the consolidation of a defensive perimeter that the Americans would find too costly to breach, required the Americans to respond with the restraint and war weariness of a European power rather than the industrial fury of the nation that was actually attacked. The Americans did not respond with restraint. They responded by converting their economy to war production at a rate Japanese strategic planning had not modeled. By 1943, American shipyards were replacing Pacific Fleet losses faster than Japanese operations could inflict them. By 1944, American carrier aviation had achieved a quantitative and qualitative dominance that made Japanese naval power operationally marginal. Japan is ranked here because its military capability was real. Its early operational performance was genuinely impressive, and the story of how strategic overconfidence converted genuine strength into inevitable defeat is one that runs parallel to the German story closely enough to be instructive. Italy, the reluctant belligerent. The honest assessment of Italian military power in World War II is one that Italian military historians have conducted with more rigor and less sentimentality than the popular account typically allows, and the picture that emerges is more nuanced than either the dismissive caricature or the defensive rehabilitation would suggest. Italian military performance was inconsistent in ways that had structural rather than purely cultural explanations. Italian equipment was, across most categories, significantly inferior to that of the major powers, a consequence of an industrial base that was smaller, less developed, and more dependent on imported raw materials than the strategic ambitions of Mussolini's foreign policy required. Italian infantry often fought with genuine determination in circumstances where their equipment, logistics, and command leadership gave them no realistic prospect of success. The fundamental Italian strategic problem was that Italy entered the war as a major power in Mussolini's political imagination and a secondary power in every material measurement that mattered. The gap between those two assessments was paid for by Italian soldiers in North Africa, in Greece, in the Soviet Union, and eventually in the campaign up the Italian peninsula that converted their own country into a battlefield. On Italy's effective exit from the Axis in September of 1943, the armistice with the Allies following the Allied invasion of Sicily was not a betrayal of a military alliance in the conventional sense. It was the rational response of a nation that had been asked to sustain a strategic posture its material capacity had never been adequate to support. France, the collapse and the continuation. France's ranking in this analysis requires splitting the country into two distinct entities that coexisted uncomfortably for most of the war. The France that collapsed in June of 1940 was, on paper, a major military power, larger army than Germany in some assessments, significant armor, the Maginot Line, a colonial empire with global reach. The speed and completeness of its defeat, the 6 weeks from German offensive to French armistice, represents one of the most studied military collapses in modern history, and the analysis consistently returns to the same conclusion. France did not lack military resources. It lacked the command doctrine, the decision-making tempo, and the institutional flexibility to respond to an operational approach that its planning had not modeled. The Free French continuation under de Gaulle and the French resistance operating within occupied France represented something genuinely different, a political and military persistence that operated on will rather than institutional infrastructure, and that contributed to the Allied effort in ways that the purely quantitative measures of military power fail to capture. France is ranked here because its story, the gap between assessed capability and operational performance, and the survival of national military agency after institutional collapse, is one of the more instructive in the entire war. The remaining powers. Significant but not decisive. The remaining significant military participants, Canada, Australia, Poland, the smaller allied nations, and the various Axis partners, contributed to the war's outcome in ways that matter to a complete account, but do not alter the fundamental power ranking at the top of this analysis. Canada's contribution to the Battle of the Atlantic, to the Italian campaign, and to the Northwest Europe campaign was operationally significant and consistently underrepresented in the popular history. Australian forces in the Pacific provided ground combat capability in a theater where every capable formation mattered. Poland, whose government in exile and armed forces continued fighting through the entire war despite the total occupation of their territory, made contributions to Allied intelligence and operational capability, most significantly at Bletchley Park, that far exceeded what their material situation should have made possible. The nations that fought as Axis partners, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Finland, bring complexity to the ranking that the simple, Allied versus Axis frame obscures. Finland's performance against the Soviet Union in the Winter War of 1939 and 40 and the Continuation War of 1941 to 44 demonstrated a military capability per capita that exceeded virtually every other nation in the war. Romania and Hungary provided significant manpower to the Eastern Front and suffered catastrophic losses at Stalingrad in service of a strategic alignment that their populations had limited enthusiasm for and their governments had limited genuine choice about. What do you think is the most underrated national military contribution of the entire war? The nation or force whose impact on the outcome is most consistently underestimated in the standard account? Put that argument in the comments, because the debate that follows is going to surface perspectives that this video does not have the space to fully develop. Every nation ranked. Every ranking the product of the same analytical framework, not the power nation started with, but the power they demonstrated when the war demanded everything they had. The United States changed what the contest was. The Soviet Union demonstrated a form of strategic endurance that its enemies had not modeled and could not match. Germany showed what operational excellence looks like when it operates in service of a fundamentally miscalculated grand strategy. Britain showed what strategic persistence looks like when the rational option is to stop. Japan showed what regional military dominance looks like when it mistakes itself for global strategic power. And the nations lower on this list showed, each in their own way, the gap between the power a nation believes it has and the power the war actually measures. The question this history leaves genuinely open is the one that runs underneath every ranking in this analysis. What is power in a total war actually made of? Is it industrial output? Is it institutional quality? Is it the specific kind of will that keeps generating armies after the losses have exceeded every pre-war model of what was survivable? The answer is probably all of those things simultaneously, weighted differently at different moments of the war, and the nation that happened to have the right combination at the right time is the one that is still here to write the history. That is not a comfortable conclusion, but it is an honest one.